Bladed Fury is a premium 2D action game with relatively light platforming and puzzle solving, published by Tencent. Yeah, that same Tencent that has a million differently skinned free battle royale games for smartphones and tablets. Yet Bladed Fury is at the complete opposite end of that spectrum, with a short premium action game that you don't have to sacrifice your life or life savings to. And I hope this is the beginning of similar projects from Tencent and its partner studios, because while Bladed Fury stumbled in some spots, overall it was a sweet and short experience that makes me want a sequel as soon as possible. So sit down, relax, and let me tell you what I loved and hated about Bladed Fury, so you can decide if you want to try it yourself. The graphics, setting, and art style are arguably the best part of Bladed Fury, especially the art style. The game takes place in ancient Roaring China, but before you know it, spirits, demons, and other fantastical elements are thrown into the mix. And the way all of it is presented is actually kind of next level, at least to me. It's almost like a light mixture of ancient Chinese art and watercolors mixed with comic book styling, and I'd be surprised if everything wasn't hand drawn. Not only that, the design of the environment, enemies, and other NPCs also stand out, like the Forbidden Forest with all its roots from hell, I assume, looking like hands hanging onto their life, helping to seal that feeling that this is an extremely creepy place only a desperate person would dare to enter. Or the war camp, where you can see the smokes and arrows flying in the background, and eventually start to run into dead bodies littered everywhere. Tian's castle, the derelict town, and more are also well drawn and designed that without any words, I could already tell or have an idea what was going on in each area, and just how effed up things must be for those living in this semi-fictional world. And Next Studio, the devs behind the game, deserve credit for delivering in this aspect. Characters and enemy designs are also quite nice, and despite the fact they all look like they could be from different games, they're also well put together that it makes enough sense and doesn't distract from Bladed Fury's presentation. You've got some enemies and characters that would perfectly fit in a Souls game, others that were very much designed from ancient Chinese lore, and then some that would fit right into a mecha anime. But as I've said, they all work together presentation wise. Chi, the main character, on the other hand, doesn't really stand out. She's kind of your typical female video game heroine with slightly loose clothing, but at least she has a big sword, so make of that what you will. As for story, we play as Chi, the second daughter of Duke Kang, one of many dukes of the Emperor. Chi tries to visit him before her sister is given away in marriage to Duke Tian. But before you know it, things get out of hand, and Chi is being blamed for the death of her father, for which she now has to try and clear her name, while also trying to reveal the evil plans of Duke Tian. It's also here that the first bump for Bladed Fury shows up. The translation from Chinese to English isn't perfect, and it often felt like I was missing a bit of context in scenarios every now and then. But even with that, I could still piece together most of the messages Bladed Fury was trying to pass, and the overall theme of the story it was telling. Bladed Fury is trying to ask questions like, why do those in power tend to think, translate and replace their happiness and fulfillment of their selfish ambitions as happiness for their subjects, even when it's clearly not so? And why do the gods, who put these selfish people in power, leave them to their vices? There were also some extra story content, like the forbidden lovers and the obvious crash wreck of an ending they would face, which I also quite liked. I also liked the fact that at the end of the game, after defeating all the bosses, the story didn't become all happy and fairy tale like, leaving us with questions to ponder on, like if things will really change for the better, if humans can really change, and possibly even setting itself up for a sequel, which I for one would be happy to get. Overall, I really enjoyed what I could get out of Bladed Fury's story, and to top it all off, it's fully voice acted too. And while I can't confirm if the Chinese voice actors were great or not because I don't speak Mandarin, I can at least say that for a $5 game, being fully voice acted is a pro. Plus, the Mandarin mixed in with Bladed Fury's music only added to the immersion of the game. And talking about the music, Bladed Fury uses a mix of ancient Chinese guitar or lute, strong bass heavy drums and flutes, which did a good job of making me feel like I was in an ancient Chinese setting. My only problem with them was the mixing of the audio, especially during boss fights where I felt drum beats should have come out more clearly and dominated the other instruments to add to the tension in that moment. Also, there's no option in the settings for dialogue and music. They are all under the same slider, and I often found the music drowns out the dialogue a little bit, which was annoying. But overall, I'd give Bladed Fury a 9 out of 10 in terms of graphics and art style, a 7 out of 10 in terms of story, and a 7 out of 10 in music just because of the mixing. These are all subjective numbers though, and I'm using them to represent how I feel rather than an objective measurement of each criteria. Basically, don't focus on the numbers too much. In terms of gameplay, Bladed Fury does a lot of really good things. But before I go into those things, I'd like to rip the band-aid off the one thing I really disliked, and unfortunately, that's controls. There are 3 things I really dislike about the control options in Bladed Fury. First, the lack of any form of gamepad support. Honestly, I'm not sure why this is still a struggle with mobile games in 2022. There are a lot of things Google don't get right with Android gaming, especially in showcasing premium games and not just pay-to-win games, or the fact that major OS updates will break games and leave them in the desert of abandoned mobile games, even though customers have paid for them. But support for controllers isn't one of them. Most Android versions over the years have support for every kind of control, from generic Bluetooth controllers to PlayStation and Xbox controllers, and even mouse and keyboard support through OTG cables or wirelessly. So it still boggles my mind that a fast-paced action game like Bladed Fury got released without it in 2022, and I feel like the devs are doing themselves a huge disservice with this decision, especially if they were hoping to attract a wider audience, for instance those used to playing on consoles. Secondly, touch controls can't be remapped or resized, which is another odd decision that's also going to be annoying for those used to touch controls. Personally, I had issues sometimes missing button presses, performing wrong actions, and I felt like all the action buttons needed a little bit of space between them as they seemed overly crammed together. But alas, nothing to be done about it. I did mostly get used to the controls by the end of the game, but parrying, which is something I'm already bad at in games like Dead Cells with gamepad support, was almost out of the question in Bladed Fury, especially as it required perfect timing, so quick dodge was the only way for me, and at least a viable option for most of the game. The third thing that annoyed me about controls in Bladed Fury was the touch controls getting in my view quite a few times. There were times where an enemy would be behind the controls and I'd have no idea what was coming my way, which made incoming attacks harder to see and get away from. I wish the camera was more zoomed out in these situations, or again controller support with the ability to idle touch controls would have fixed the issue, but sadly none of this is possible. It's sad that Bladed Fury couldn't quite get arguably the most important part of a fast-paced 2D action game right, which is precise controls. Don't get me wrong, it is usable and at some points enjoyable, but every time I miss an action, a jump, a parry, or I got hit by an enemy I couldn't see, it just made me irritated that Bladed Fury doesn't even have the basic touch controls button mapping that can be found in other games, much less gamepad support. On the positive side of things, the enemies in Bladed Fury are a real highlight of the game, and I feel Next Studios found a real balance between making them challenging and making Chi feel powerful enough to take on all threats. Focusing on the enemies, it started out as simply designed soldiers, but as it turns out, this is just a way to get players kind of used to the basics, like how to deal with basic enemies, shielded ones, or enemies that attack from range. Then this happens all of a sudden, and enemy designs and abilities just go up to 11 from there. You've got different types of flying demon heads that shoot out spirit bombs one moment and slap Chi across the level with giant muscle hands the next. Archer type or ranged enemies with attacks that can be deflected back to them, mixed in with close range attacks, or the ability to rain down fire that can only be dodged, not parried. Giant enemies with a shield on one hand and their heads on the other hand, shooting out electric bolts across the level. And there's more in between this. with a mix of regular enemies and mini bosses, and there was a great mix of them during my 4 to 5 hour run. And the mini bosses were so good that anytime one showed up on screen, it was an highlight of the game for me. They were tough and challenging, changing up whatever combat pattern I was settling comfortably into without having the crazy long health bars of the main bosses. And sometimes, Bladed Fury will throw like 2 of these mini bosses at Chi at the same time, which I felt was a good way to add an extra challenge to combat, but also show how Chi's new abilities add to combat and how she has progressed as a character combat wise. Boss fights were also pretty good for like 90% of the time I had to face them. They come with like 3 health bars and usually have like 2 or so attack phases. So while they were tough to beat on the first try sometimes, usually by the second or third try, after learning most of their movesets or finding a way to defeat them, it's usually easy enough to get through them. Well, except for the final boss. And this was one of those areas I again felt the touch controls got in the way. You see, the main boss was just way tougher than any other encounter I had had before. My attacks didn't really do any significant damage to him, and all he needed was 2 or 3 attacks to absolutely end me. And this was on his first phase, with his second phase being able to annihilate me in one snap. While this was a significant difficulty leap from previous bosses, which some might find unfair, I personally felt it was a fight that required more focus on dodging, parrying if you are good at it, and timing in terms of Chi's special powers. But unfortunately, because of Bladed Fury's jumbled up touch controls, and admittedly my own anxiety to an extent, I always found myself making mistakes and tapping the wrong buttons. And for most of the old game, my feelings were Bladed Fury could use a button mapping options, but by the final boss, I was just like, this is BS without Game Pass support. And I probably spent like an hour and a half of my 5 hours with the game trying to defeat just this one guy. But then again, maybe it's just me and others will end up having an easier time with him and Bladed Fury's controls. I've been talking about the enemies faced in Bladed Fury, but now it's time to focus on the main character herself, Chi. Just like with the enemy NPC, Chi kind of starts off simple, with only 2 weapons throughout the whole game. And these are your standard fair action game weapons, with the smaller blades being for light attacks and the big giant sword for heavy attacks. They also come with simple upgrade parts like being able to do more damage after a successful parry, or being able to hold down the heavy attack button for a charged heavier damage. One thing I really liked about the heavy sword was being able to deflect a lot of ranged attacks back to enemies, and even to the end of the game it never got old. But after the second boss, the game started giving out these literal game-changing abilities collected from the spirit of the main bosses as Chi sends them back to the underworld. And these things were so powerful, they ended up being the difference between me defeating a tough opponent and getting my ass handed to me, but also limited and balanced enough that I couldn't just spam them and cheese my way to victory every time. Some of these special abilities are also very cool to use, and they are really what sold the story that Chi is descended from a bloodline of gods, and explains why she can go toe to toe with monsters and demons. There are about 6 of these special abilities, some of them including a black hole that can be used to draw all enemies together into one easy to attack spot. Although this was my least favorite, especially when dealing with single tough enemies. There's another that lets Chi fire a turret of arrows from the sky just raining down on a particular spot. The best one for me was the one I got from defeating a spider lady that would slow down time, allowing me to throw as many hits as possible within a couple of seconds, to the extent that it almost felt like a cheat button sometimes. There was also an all-healing ability, others did one-time heavy damage and so on. And the way Next Studios tamed these abilities was by doing things like limiting the number of times they can be used till you get to a save point and basically reload them. And the more powerful the ability is, the less time the ability can be used, or the longer the recharge time is for it. There's also a bit of platforming in Bladed Fury, but it's never too difficult, and the only issue for me was sometimes missing a double jump because of those damn touch controls again. As for the level design, at first it felt a little annoying because each map is divided into several tiny areas that take a very short time to load. but because I was going through a lot of them at fairly short intervals, it was a little annoying. It felt like every 30 seconds I'd go through a 2-second black screen, with an extra second added for the frames to catch up. But the more I played, the more it felt like the level designs were perfect for Bladed Fury's short run, with it getting better from the underworld level and the main bad guy's estate, where moving from area to area also served as a means of exploration, storytelling, and some light puzzle solving. So, short stuttered loading screen aside, Bladed Fury's level design is very competent, if not good at what it's doing for the time it has to draw us in. In terms of playtime and replayability, Bladed Fury is a relatively short game that I expect to take between 3 to 5 hours for most people to finish, and it isn't really a game made for multiple playthroughs. I unlock most of Chi's movesets on my only playthrough, and the only thing I can see bringing anyone back is if not to try to beat the game on the hardest difficulty, which can only be unlocked after finishing Bladed Fury on its normal difficulty. But there's no new game plus, so you'll be starting over from scratch if you choose to play again. But for the price of $5, I can't really blame Next Studios for going for a single focused experience. As for bugs and performance, I faced 0 bugs during my entire playthrough. There were no crashes at all, but performance wasn't quite as smooth sailing. For whatever reason, Bladed Fury frame rate was between 38 to 45 FPS on the Snapdragon 870, and while I think the game is aesthetically beautiful, I don't think it does anything graphically to make it hit such an average frame rate, as my phone wasn't even getting warm, much less hot during an extended gaming session. Don't get me wrong, it was perfectly playable, and I didn't feel it during actual gameplay. But for a hack and slash to the action game like Bladed Fury, faster is always better, and hopefully a future update fixes the issue, if you can call it that. So in terms of gameplay, I'd give Bladed Fury a 7 out of 10, with great enemy designs and enjoyable to use special abilities held back by poor touch controls implementation. As for replayability and length, a 4 out of 10, because this is a short game without too many incentives to go for a second playthrough. But don't get me wrong, and I'll state again that this isn't a bad thing because of what Next Studios' focus was on making Bladed Fury a short but sweet action game. And in terms of bugs and performance, a 7 out of 10 because while very playable and basically bug free, Bladed Fury doesn't hit 60 or 120 FPS. And a 10 out of 10 for pricing because of its $5 price tag. So overall, these are my pros and cons after playing Bladed Fury, with pros being what I loved about Bladed Fury, cons being what I hated, and meh being what I think could have been handled better in the game. My pros include the art style of the game, which is hands down great and kind of unique in its genre. Enemy design, abilities, animations are also quite nice and done very well. Boss fights are mostly a strong point. The price of the game, plus a premium game from Tencent, can't say I'd mind more after my experience with Bladed Fury. The game is fully voice acted. I really like using Chi's special abilities and like the fact they can't be abused. Even though a few things seem lost in translation, I still think the game was able to ask some thought-provoking and relevant questions. I also liked how the game map is mixed with some light puzzle solving. As for my maze, Bladed Fury is smooth to play, but no 60 FPS at the very least is disappointing. The game is not really meant for multiple playthroughs. No proper controls for music and voice, so they kind of blend into each other without proper separation. And sometimes music wasn't always used for what I felt like the right scene. Although overall it's solid, and it sold the ancient worried China aesthetic of the game for me. As for my cons, there's no gamepad support, which I felt is really bad decision. Touch controls are not flexible or mappable, and it is kind of jumbled together in its default form, leading to lots of mistakes and mispresses during combat and platforming. Touch controls sometimes also blocked my view of enemies. Overall, I enjoyed my time with Bladed Fury. I would probably rate it personally as a 9 out of 10 game if it wasn't for its touch controls. My subjective rating for Bladed Fury therefore is a 7 out of 10, and I'd recommend it to anyone who likes 2D action games. but is also very much used to playing with touch controls. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Tide out.